When the gates of Auschwitz finally swung open in January 1945, the soldiers who walked through them stepped into a nightmare that words could barely capture. The air was cold, heavy, and silent, except for the ghosts of more than 1 million souls who had been murdered there. What the Allied forces found that day was not just a camp. It was the remains of a machine built to erase human beings from existence. Before the world knew the name Auschwitz, Germany had invaded Poland and ignited the flames of World War II. In the chaos of occupation, the SS, Heinrich Himmler's elite guard, took an old Polish army barracks and turned it into something else. They called it Auschwitz I. At first, it was a prison for soldiers and enemies of the Reich, but that was only the beginning. Not far away, construction began on a second place, Auschwitz II to Birkenau. It was larger, it was quieter, and it was designed for one purpose only: death. Of the 1.3 million human beings dragged through the Auschwitz gates, 1.1 million never walked out. Their bodies were burned, their names were forgotten, their stories were silenced. That number alone should have been enough to shock the conscience of the world. But then the survivors began to speak, and what they told us was far worse than numbers. It was the truth of what human beings are capable of when we stop seeing each other as human. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Over the next 12 years, he turned hate into policy. The idea of wiping out an entire people did not begin with him, but he was the one who gave it machinery, manpower, and method. He called it the final solution to the Jewish question. Before the war, Germany already had concentration camps. They held political prisoners, trade unionists, anyone who spoke out. But those camps were warnings. They were not yet the end. The real horror was still being designed. When the Nazis marched into Poland, they needed more room for their prisoners. They found it in the town of Auschwitz. The Germans called it Auschwitz. A man named Rudolf Höss was put in charge. He was the first commandant. He saw the potential immediately. Auschwitz sat at the meeting point of 44 railway lines, a perfect junction to deliver human cargo from all over Europe. Trains could come from anywhere, and once they arrived, there was no way out. At first, Höss ordered the construction of a crematorium. He said it was for burning the bodies of prisoners who had been executed or who had died on their own. But by May 1942, 3 ovens were installed. They could burn 340 bodies in a single day, and soon they were not just burning the dead. They were killing the living to keep the ovens full. The crematorium became a symbol, not of efficiency, but of how completely the Nazis had abandoned any belief that human life had value. Himmler came to visit in March 1941. He stood in the middle of Auschwitz and gave an order: expand, bring more victims, build more chambers, kill more people. And so they did. They built a second camp right next to the first, Birkenau. It was finished in October of that same year. The original camp held 15,000 prisoners. Birkenau could hold more than 90,000. The machine was just getting started. Most of the people sent to Auschwitz were Jewish, nearly 1.1 million of them. The rest, about 200,000, were Polish Catholics, Roma and Sinti, Soviet prisoners of war, gay men and women, Jehovah's Witnesses, and those the Nazis called unfit, people with disabilities, people who did not fit the mold of the so-called master race. It is one of the greatest tragedies in human history, and the scale of it is almost impossible to feel. The mind hears the numbers and struggles to connect them to real people, real mothers, real children, real hands that once held photographs of faces they would never see again. When the Soviet Red Army finally arrived, they found a mountain, not of stone, of shoes. Thousands upon thousands of shoes, worn, empty, left behind. Someone took a photograph. It is one of the most powerful images of the 20th century, not because of what it shows, but because of what it does not show. The feet that filled those shoes, the lives that walked in them, all gone. The prisoners came packed into cattle cars. No food, no water, no air, standing in the filth of their own bodies, pressed against strangers, traveling for days or weeks toward a destination they did not choose. And when the doors slid open, they were blinded by light and screamed at by men with dogs. What waited for them was worse than anything they could have imagined. They were given triangles of cloth to sew onto their jackets, just above the numbers tattooed into their skin. By July 1942, most of those arriving were Jewish. They stood in lines while Nazi doctors examined them with cold clinical eyes. A glance to the left, a glance to the right. Left meant labor, right meant death. Those sent to the right were told they were going to take a shower. They were told to undress. They were told to remember where they left their clothes. But the showerheads did not release water. They released a poison gas called Zyklon B. These prisoners were never registered. Their names never entered any database. They simply arrived, breathed poison, and became ash. We will never know exactly how many. We will never know who they were. That was part of the design. The triangles had colors. Political prisoners wore red. German criminals wore green. Roma and Sinti wore black. Gay men wore pink. Jews wore a yellow badge shaped like the Star of David. Each color was a label. Each label was a judgment. And at the bottom of this racial hierarchy were the Jewish prisoners. They were the most despised, the most dehumanized, the most likely to be killed for no reason at all. Those who survived the first selection were not saved. They were simply enslaved. They worked until their bodies gave out. They starved slowly. They caught diseases that spread like fire through overcrowded barracks, and one by one, they collapsed. The day began at 4:30 in the morning for the men. The women woke even earlier. A gong rang. The block supervisor walked through the barracks swinging a stick, hitting anyone who moved too slowly. Prisoners rushed to filthy latrines that spread infection faster than food ever brought strength. Breakfast was a mug of black liquid they called coffee. 500 milligrams, barely enough to wet the mouth. Then another gong. All prisoners had to stand outside in rows of 10. They stood for hours, sometimes in snow, sometimes in mud, waiting for the SS to finish their own morning routines. The count had to be perfect. Every number accounted for. Then work began. No breaks, no rest. Even trips to the latrine were timed and recorded. Every second of every day belonged to the camp. At midday, they were given soup. Watery, cold, often spoiled. The prisoners described it as barely edible. At night, 300 grams of bread, most of it moldy, much of it unfit for a dog. But they ate it anyway. Hunger has no standards. After the evening meal came the second roll call. Again they stood in rows, again they were counted, and this time punishments were handed out. Whippings, hangings, public executions meant to terrify everyone watching. If one prisoner was missing, no one moved. No one ate, no one slept. Everyone stood at attention until that missing person was found, dead or alive. Sometimes the search took all night. At last, the gong for curfew. Silence fell over Auschwitz. Thousands of prisoners lay crammed into wooden barracks built for horses, not humans. They slept shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same stale air, dreaming of homes they would never see again. Jewish prisoners were not allowed to receive mail. No letters from mothers, no news from wives, no photographs of children growing up without them. They were cut off from the world completely, as if they had never existed outside the wire. But in the darkness, one man was still awake. Josef Mengele. The doctors called him a physician. The prisoners called him the angel of death. He conducted experiments in the middle of the night. On twins, on dwarfs, on babies still too young to cry for their mothers. He injected chemicals into eyes to change their color. He sewed children together. He measured pain as if it were data. His cruelty had no limit, and because of him, thousands suffered not just death, but degradation, even in their final moments. The night of terror was long, but it could not last forever. In 1945, the Soviet army approached. The Nazis knew the end was coming. They forced 60,000 prisoners onto death marches, walking for days in freezing cold, with no food, no shoes, no mercy. Thousands more died on those roads, shot for falling behind or simply collapsing from exhaustion. When the Red Army entered Auschwitz, they found 7,800 survivors, sick, broken, barely alive. The rest were gone. More than 1 million souls extinguished. Today, the world remembers. We teach the names, we look at the photographs, we walk through the gates, and try to feel the weight of what happened there. But memory is fragile, and silence is dangerous. We must never forget what human beings did to other human beings at Auschwitz, not because we are afraid it will happen again, but because we know deep down that it can. And the only thing standing between that darkness and the light is us.